On New Year's Eve, a black storm beat hard across the open land around Yedral Ranch. Rain struck the windows like thrown gravel. Wind bent the cottonwoods low, and thunder rolled over the hills. Inside the big ranch house, the Sutton family kept close to the hearth, listening as the old year died in the storm. Father Sutton stood near the fire, measuring the weather by sound. Mrs. Sutton glanced toward the dark road.
No decent soul should be out on a night like this.
Little Johnny pressed his face to the window, hoping to see the new year come in with lightning. Then, through the roar of rain, they heard it. A woman's voice, faint, breaking, calling for help. Frank Sutton reached the door first. He threw it open, and the wind drove rain across the floor. Father Sutton grabbed a lantern, and within moments, both men were riding into the dark, following the voice. They found her near the road, soaked to the bone, clinging to her saddle with the last of her strength. Her name was Hetty Dunlap.
I remember that name well. I'm Abel Beecham, though most folks around these parts simply call me Mr. B. And that night, watching Hetty Dunlap tremble in the rain, Frank Sutton did not yet know he was looking at the woman who would one day ride through another storm to save him.
Frank reached up to lift her down, but she gripped the saddle horn and pointed toward the old mission road. "Not me first," she whispered. "The driver." Only then did they understand. 9 miles back, George the stage driver lay trapped beside his overturned coach. Hetty had ridden through darkness and floodwater to bring help for a man she barely knew. Her small body was nearly spent. But her courage had not broken. And in that moment, Frank Sutton looked at the trembling stranger and saw not helplessness, but courage. They brought George in first, just as Hetty had begged. The stage driver was bruised, bleeding, and half frozen, but alive. Father Sutton and Frank carried him through the door while Mrs. Sutton hurried for blankets and hot coffee. Hetty stood near the hearth, soaked and trembling, watching until George opened his eyes. "He'll make it," Father Sutton said. Only then did Hetty's strength leave her. She swayed once, and Frank caught her before she struck the floor. By morning, the storm had passed, but the story of her ride had already filled the house. She was not a wandering stranger. She was Miss Hetty Dunlap, the new schoolteacher sent to the settlement. Father Sutton's face warmed at once. "A girl who rides 9 miles in that weather to save another soul doesn't sleep under any roof but mine while I've got one." Mrs. Sutton offered a polite smile, but her eyes noticed everything. Hetty's worn gloves, plain dress, small trunk, and the absence of family standing behind her. Later, Frank brought Hetty warm broth while she rested in a chair near the fire. Johnny sat close by, staring at her as if she had stepped out of a frontier legend. "Were you scared?" he asked. Hetty gave a tired little smile. "The whole way." Johnny frowned. "Then how were you brave?" Frank answered softly before she could. "Being brave means going while you're frightened." Hetty looked up at him. For the first time in years, she felt seen rightly. In the clear winter days that followed, Yedral Ranch began to gather Hetty in. Each morning, she stood before the schoolhouse blackboard, teaching Johnny and the settlement children their sums while cold sunlight crossed the floor. Each evening, she sat near the hearth, mending torn sleeves, reading aloud, or listening while Father Sutton told stories of the old trail. She tried not to love it too quickly, but Yedral had a way of making room. Johnny followed her everywhere, asking questions faster than she could answer. Father Sutton treated her courage as settled fact. Even Lolita Selden, the beautiful neighbor everyone expected Frank to marry, greeted Hetty with kindness instead of pride. One cold morning, Johnny frowned at Hetty's thin coat as she buttoned it for the walk to school. "That coat ain't fit for Yedra winter," he said. Hetty smiled and tugged the worn collar closer. "Then one day, I shall have to come back wearing one grand enough to satisfy you." Johnny laughed, but Frank heard the words. Hetty had meant them lightly, yet for reasons she could not explain. The little promise stayed with her. Frank was gentlest of all. On cold mornings, he walked her to the schoolhouse, placing himself between Hetty and the bitter wind. They spoke of horses, books, weather, and children. Nothing bold, nothing dangerous. Yet every quiet word made Hetty feel less like a guest. One evening, Mrs. Sutton praised Lolita's fine family and rich property. Frank looked into the fire. Land is a fine thing, Mother, but it doesn't make a woman kind. Mrs. Sutton heard the warning. Hetty heard the defense. And for the first time, she wondered if Yedral might truly become home. Mrs. Sutton did not scold openly after Frank defended Hetty. She was too careful for blunt cruelty. Instead, she began arranging the house the way she arranged her best parlor, quietly, firmly, with every chair set where she wanted it. Lolita Selden came often to supper, bright and gracious in her fine riding dress. Mrs. Sutton praised Lolita's beauty, her family name, and the wide acres that would someday be hers. Whenever Frank entered the room, Mrs. Sutton found a reason to seat Lolita beside him. And whenever Hetty needed an escort to church or a school social, Julian Selden appeared with his pleasant smile and polished manners. Julian was kind, respectable, easy to thank. But Hetty's heart never lifted at the sound of his step. Lolita noticed what Mrs. Sutton was arranging, and what Hetty was trying to hide. One afternoon, while she and Hetty walked beside the frosted garden fence, Lolita glanced back toward the ranch house and gave a soft laugh. Mrs. Sutton may arrange chairs at table, Lolita said, but she cannot arrange hearts. Hetty's face warmed. I do not know what you mean. Lolita did not tease her. She only squeezed Hetty's gloved hand. That kindness unsettled Hetty more than jealousy would have. Lolita was not cruel. Julian was not cruel. Even Mrs. Sutton hid her plans beneath manners. And that made the danger harder to fight. Because Hetty was beginning to love a man, everyone else seemed determined to place beside another woman. Frank and Hetty's love did not arrive with grand words. It grew in small, steady acts. When rain threatened the schoolhouse, Frank came early with tools and repaired the broken shutter before Hetty's books could be spoiled. He said little, but he made sure the room stayed dry. Another afternoon, a young horse spooked in the corral, and Frank cut his hand catching the reins. Hetty saw the blood, led him to the water pump, and washed the wound clean before tying it with a strip of cloth. Neither spoke much while she worked. But Frank watched her careful hands, and Hetty felt the silence between them become warmer than conversation. Later that week, Frank helped Johnny gentle and nervous colt. He stood beside the boy at the corral fence, speaking low and steady until the trembling animal stopped pulling away. Hetty watched from the schoolhouse steps and understood something about him. Frank hated seeing any frightened creature trapped. That evening, as he rode beside her on the road back to Yedral, Hetty asked, "If you hate seeing anything trapped, why do you let others arrange your life?" Frank looked ahead at the wet road. "I reckon peace in a house can be a hard habit to break." Hetty carried those words like a secret. Then she told him about her sister's crowded home in San Francisco, and how she had learned to take up as little room as possible. Frank pulled his horse to a stop. Hetty stopped beside him. "You take up the right amount of room here," he said. Her eyes filled, and she looked away before tears could betray her. Neither said love, but both heard it. The wound came at supper, with every chair filled and every eye close enough to witness shame. Hetty and Frank entered late through the front door, rain still shining on Frank's coat and mud darkening the hem of Hetty's dress. They had been helping a lost schoolchild, little Tomas Rivera, find his way home before darkness swallowed the trail. Hetty expected questions. She did not expect judgment. Mrs. Sutton sat at the head of the table. She looked from Frank's wet coat to Hetty's muddy skirt, and her voice came out calm enough to sound almost polite. "A school teacher in a dependent position must be careful how often she requires my son's sympathy." The room went still. Hetty's face drained of color. George lowered his fork. Johnny stared at his mother as if he had heard a stranger speak. Frank stepped forward at once. "Mother, Hetty helped find Tomas before dark. I was with her because I chose to be." Mrs. Sutton's mouth tightened. A generous man does not always know when his generosity is being used. That struck deeper than anger. It named Hetty's worst fear, that her need for home looked like scheming. Lolita rose from her chair and crossed to Hetty's side. She took Hetty's hand in front of everyone. No one who knows Miss Dunlap could think such a thing. Father Sutton's voice came low and hard from the far end of the table. Nor will it be said at my table again. But Hetty had already heard enough. She thanked them quietly, pulled her hand gently from Lolita's, and stepped from the room. Behind her, the supper table stayed silent. And for the first time since she had come to Yedral, Hetty felt like the open door had begun to close. By morning, Hetty had made her decision. She sat very straight at breakfast, though her hands were cold beneath the table. When the school term closes, she said, I shall return to San Francisco. Father Sutton set down his coffee. No, child, not for one cruel sentence. Johnny's eyes filled at once. You can't go, Miss Hetty. Mrs. Sutton looked away but said nothing. Frank opened his mouth as if to speak, then his eyes shifted toward his mother, and the words died before they reached him. That silence hurt Hetty more than protest. She told herself he was being honorable. She told herself silence was kinder than making promises his family would resent. Later, Frank found her alone in the schoolhouse, folding lesson papers into neat stacks, though her hands would not stay steady. He stood near the doorway, hat in his hands. Is there no one at Yedral you regret leaving? He asked. Hetty kept her eyes on the papers. There are many I shall remember kindly. That was not what I asked. His voice carried pain, and it nearly broke her. She wanted to say his name. She wanted to say Yedral was the first place she had ever wanted to stay. But she remembered Mrs. Sutton's accusation, Lolita's rich future, and her own small trunk waiting upstairs at the ranch house. So Hetty chose the old habit, leaving before she could be asked to go. No, she whispered. No one in that way. Frank's face closed. He nodded once, as if he had received the answer he deserved, then stepped back into the cold morning. Hetty stood alone among the schoolbooks and knew the truth. She had called sacrifice by a noble name, but really, it was fear. When Hetty left Yedral, the ranch disappeared behind rain and dust. She sat inside the stagecoach with her hands folded tight in her lap, determined not to cry where strangers could see. Every turn of the wheels carried her farther from the hearth, the schoolhouse, Johnny's voice, and the man she had denied. By the time the stage reached the railway station, Hetty had nearly convinced herself that leaving was the honorable thing. Then she stepped down and heard her name. Frank Sutton stood near the platform, dusty from hard riding, holding a paper parcel in both hands as if it were the only excuse he could find for coming. I brought oranges, he said awkwardly. City fruit can be poor this time of year. It was such a foolish, tender excuse that Hetty almost smiled. For one suspended moment, the train, the rain, and the world seemed to wait. Frank looked at her as if one honest sentence might save them both. Hetty held the parcel against her heart, praying he would speak. He drew a breath. Then the train whistle blew. Frank glanced toward the train, then back at Hetty, and the courage in his face faltered. I'll write, he said. Hetty nodded, though everything inside her was breaking. Then she boarded the train with the oranges in her hands and love still unspoken between them. San Francisco felt crowded in a way Yedral never had. In her sister's house, the stairs were narrow, the rooms were shared, and even her place at the table felt borrowed. No one was cruel enough for her to complain. That almost made it worse. She had once believed shelter was enough. Now she knew the difference between being housed and being home. Frank's letters came at first. They were plain, careful letters, full of ranch weather, Johnny's lessons, Father Sutton's greetings, George's complaints about the roads, and small tender lines Frank seemed almost afraid to write. Hetty kept them tied with a ribbon in her trunk. At night, when the house finally quieted, she read them until the paper softened at the folds. Then 1 week passed without a letter, then another, then a month. Her sister told her men often grew forgetful when distance made forgetting easy. Others hinted that Frank would surely marry wealthy Lolita Selden after all, not a poor schoolteacher who had nothing to offer. Hetty tried to be sensible. She kept teaching. She kept smiling. She kept her grief folded small where no one could see it. But each mail day, hope rose against her will, and each empty hand told her the same cruel lie. Frank had forgotten her. She did not know that far away at Yedral, Frank Sutton had fallen from a horse and was lying in a sick room, too ashamed to let anyone send for her. The truth came with George, standing at Hetty's door with his hat crushed in both hands. One look at his weathered face told her the news was not small. "It's Frank," he said. Hetty gripped the back of a chair. A week earlier, at a rodeo near Yedral, Frank had taken a young horse into the ring. The horse reared hard, slipped in the mud, and came down wrong. Frank was thrown beneath it and crushed before the men could pull him clear. His back was hurt. His leg was badly broken. The doctor could not promise what would heal and what would not. "He may walk again," George said quietly, "or he may not." Hetty sat down as if her own bones had failed. "Why did no one write?" George looked toward the floor. "Frank made us swear not to send for you, said you had gone free." Those words opened the whole sorrow before her. Frank had not forgotten her. He had hidden himself. Hetty saw it then. The same old wound in both of them. She had left before she could be unwanted. Frank had gone silent before he could become a burden. George lifted his eyes. "I owed you my life from last New Year's storm," he said. "Figured I owed you the truth now." Hetty stood, steady for the first time since he had arrived. "Is the New Year's stage still running?" George's tired face warmed. "It will be if you're on it." Another New Year's Eve storm carried Hetty back to Yedral. The rain was colder this time, thin and sharp, sweeping across the stage road as if trying to turn her back. But Hetty sat beside George, wrapped in her new fur-lined coat. It was the coat she had once promised Johnny she would wear if she ever returned. Now it was proof that she had remembered Yedral, even when she had tried to forget her own heart. When the stage reached the ranch, Father Sutton opened the front door before she could knock. He must have heard the wheels through the storm. For one breath, he only stared. Then his rough hands closed around hers. "Thank God," he whispered. Johnny came running, older by a year, but suddenly a child again. Mrs. Sutton stood behind him, pale with sleeplessness and pride she could no longer hide behind. She saw the fur-lined coat Hetty wore, saw the rain in her hair, and could not find one sharp word to say. Hetty asked only, "Where is Frank?" Father Sutton led her down the hall to Frank's room. Frank lay propped against pillows, thinner than before, one leg braced beneath the quilt. Pain had changed him, but it had not erased him. When he saw Hetty, joy flashed across his face. Then shame covered it. "You should not have come," he said. Hetty set the fur-lined coat over a chair and sat carefully on the edge of the bed beside him. "I know. I have spent most of my life doing what I should. It has made me very lonely." Frank turned his face away. "I may never be what I was. I did not come for what you were." His hand trembled on the blanket. "I cannot ask you to bind yourself to a crippled man." "You did not ask," Hetty said softly. That was the trouble. He looked back at her then. She took his hand and held it with both of hers. "I left because I thought leaving was noble. You stopped writing because you thought silence was kind. We were both proud in the name of goodness." A broken laugh caught in Frank's throat. Hetty's eyes filled, but her voice did not shake. "I love you, Frank Sutton, not because you rode well, or walked straight, or made Yedral easy for me. I love you because you made room for me before I knew how to claim it." She leaned close. "Now I am claiming it." Frank wept quietly then, like a man whose future had been handed back to him. Hetty leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. Not pity, not farewell, a promise. In the doorway, Mrs. Sutton lowered her eyes. "Miss Dunlap," she said, her voice trembling, "I wronged you." Hetty turned. "I thought you wanted my son's sympathy," Mrs. Sutton said. "Now I see you brought him courage when the rest of us were drowning him in fear." Father Sutton placed a firm hand on Hetty's shoulder. "Then let this house hear it first. This girl rode into our lives saving one man, and came back saving another. She belongs here." Johnny ran to Hetty and threw his arms around her, and for the first time, Hetty did not feel like a guest. She felt like home had opened its arms and finally called her by name. Morning broke clear over Yedral Ranch. After 2 storms, the world looked washed clean. Sunlight touched the wet roofs, the dripping fences, and the open road that had brought Hetty back. By noon, word had spread through the settlement. Miss Dunlap had returned. The schoolchildren came first, carrying folded cards, paper flowers, and small sprigs of winter cedar tied with string. Johnny stood proudly among them, telling anyone who would listen that Miss Hetty had saved George from one storm and Frank from another. George told the ranch hands the same thing, only louder. At the family table, Mrs. Sutton placed a cup of coffee before Hetty herself, not like a servant, not like a hostess humoring a guest, like a mother making room. Frank was not strong enough to walk the room yet, but Father Sutton and George had helped him into a cushioned chair near the fire. He sat pale and still wounded, but no longer hidden behind shame. When Hetty rose from her chair, Frank reached for her hand. He did not try to prove anything. He only held on. And Hetty let him, not as a burden, as trust. Father Sutton lifted his coffee cup, his voice rough with feeling. "To courage," he said. "The kind that rides through storms, and the kind that stays after them." Weeks later, when Frank could stand a little longer, the family gathered at the little settlement church with the schoolchildren waiting outside in their best clothes. Hetty wore the fur-lined coat Johnny had once teased her about, and Frank stood beside her with a cane in one hand and her hand in the other. There was no grand display, only vows spoken clearly, tears wiped quietly, and Mrs. Sutton standing in the front pew, smiling through the shame she had finally laid down. That evening, Hetty and Frank sat together on the veranda, while Johnny and the schoolchildren laughed in the yard below. Behind them, Yedral's door stood open. Hetty had not been tolerated. She had not been pitied. She had come home. And she had learned that love is not a place you earn by disappearing. It is a home you claim by staying.
Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed it, please like and share. It really helps us. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Before you go, rate this story 0 to 10 in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I'll see you in the next tale.